At the beginning of last month, my grandma on my mom's side of the family passed away. This is following the death of my grandma on my dad's side of the family at the end of July, so just a couple of months apart. A really coordinated effort for two women who I'm not even sure ever met each other. I loved both of my grandmas very much, obviously. I haven't seen either of them in a while, really, but they were a huge part of my childhood. My grandma on my mom's side of my family was almost like another parent to me. They had been sick for a while before they passed away, so I felt like I was fully prepared for the sadness that I was sure was going to come, but it just didn't. Days and then weeks passed, and honestly, I started to feel a little bit guilty. I mean, I loved my grandmas, but you wouldn't know it looking from the outside in. I wasn't sad or even upset. I was fine. But was I really? Put very simply, grief is our process for coping with a loss. And a lot of times that loss is death, but not always. You can grieve things like the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, or even something conceptual like the loss of your youth. There's so many symptoms involved with grief that you might expect, and then there's so many that you might not. As the days went by after my grandma's died, some kind of strange things started to happen to me. My sleep was the first thing to really start to suffer, and I mean really start to suffer. I'm talking it would take me like 4 or 5 hours on a routine basis to fall asleep. I started to feel really heavy all the time, like weighed down, like I was walking through quicksand all day. And I got this weird kind of anxiety in my body, like I just always was uncomfortable in my own skin and uncomfortable with myself and uncomfortable in any setting. Like anywhere that I was, I just didn't want to be there. I don't know where I wanted to be, I just didn't want to be there. All of this made for a state of mind where it was really hard for me to focus. It felt like my head was just full of noise all the time. And then the second that I wanted to focus and have a purposeful thought, just head empty. And then I looked up the symptoms of grief, and sure enough, these were some of the common ones. When discussing grief, we have the physical symptoms, we have the behavioral symptoms, and then we have the emotional symptoms. The emotions that come with grief can be surprisingly complicated. The experience is typically described as coming in waves. So a really strong wave of emotion can hit you, and then you can feel better. You can feel like you're getting over the grief for some period of time until another really strong wave of emotion comes back and puts you right back into it. Another emotional feature of grief is these kind of conflicting feelings. Like I mentioned, both my grandmas were sick before they passed away, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't glad that their suffering was over. And then of course I feel guilty about that. I mean, now not only am I not sad, I'm literally relieved that my grandmas are dead. But these aren't uncommon thoughts or feelings to have. I think a lot of people who have had a sick loved one pass away would be able to relate. Let's get more specific. What are some of the core emotions involved in grief? Let's look at it through a model that a lot of people are familiar with. When people think of grief, they usually think of the 5 stages. It's a model developed by doctors Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, and it describes some common emotional phases that people go through while they're grieving. For anyone unfamiliar, the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they seem pretty straightforward on the face of it, but I want to kind of go through each of them and talk a little bit about some commentary that Dr. Kessler has on each of the stages. Dr. Kessler paints denial as a tool to help us survive the grief. It's the first stage, and it often occurs when the shock of the grief is still really fresh and kind of too much to process in its entirety. The idea is that by experiencing a degree of denial around our loss, we really only take in as much of the loss as we can handle at the moment. As we start to process the loss, the denial starts to fade and the other phases begin. As we move past the denial phase, we begin to feel the pain that we weren't letting in. Dr. Kessler writes that anger gives structure to that pain. Anger is this very tangible emotion that we're usually used to experiencing and managing. We can think of it almost as a channel for all of the powerful and sometimes confusing emotions that we can feel during the grieving process. If 2 words could describe this stage, they would be if only. It's the process of either getting lost in the past or in possibilities of what we could have done differently to either prevent our loss or what we could do differently to change this circumstance in the future. This kind of rumination often leads to strong feelings of guilt and blaming yourself in some way for the loss. Depression comes when we move from ruminating on the past or the future into the present moment. We fully experience the pain of our circumstance, but it's appropriate. That's the key thing that Dr. Kessler points out about the depression stage. We so often think of depression, especially clinical depression, as something to be fixed. In this case, you're depressed because something very depressing happened to you. So in a way, arguably one of the most important parts of the depression stage is just to accept that this is the way that you feel, which brings us to the final stage. I think this stage is named very deliberately. It's not called getting over it or getting better. It's called the acceptance stage because to accept your loss doesn't mean that you're okay with it. You just accept and come to the realization that this is your new reality. And while it might not entirely take away the pain, it could give you a sense of closure. Honestly, I've never liked the fact that they're called the 5 stages of grief. Like, the word stages to me suggests that you're supposed to move through them in this kind of linear fashion, or that you can't experience more than one of them at a time. Truthfully though, not everyone goes through all 5 stages, and you can definitely move back and forth in between them. These are more descriptions of common experiences that people have following a loss. By now you might be getting the sense that grief is very complicated and very individualized. So naturally, there are several different forms and trajectories of grief that are worth exploring. Knowing what I know now about grief, I think part of the reason why I didn't grieve the loss of either of my grandmas so hard is because I knew it was coming, and I kind of came to terms with it beforehand. This is sometimes called anticipatory grief, grieving a loss almost beforehand when you know that the loss is imminent, like if you have a sick relative. Anticipatory grief can sometimes lead to abbreviated grief following the loss, which is kind of an expedited grieving process. It took 2 weeks following the death of my maternal grandma before it really finally hit me. I woke up one day and I felt the sadness that I was always expecting to feel, and the other symptoms that I had been feeling that whole time finally made sense. It could be that I was experiencing some denial before that, or maybe I had mildly delayed grief that doesn't come following the loss for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years. Everybody's timeline is different. I also wonder now, knowing what I know, if a lot of the physical symptoms I was having either came from emotions that I didn't realize I was having or wasn't allowing myself to express. This is sometimes called inhibited grief. One of the most difficult forms of grief to deal with is cumulative grief. This is when you're grieving multiple losses at once, and as you can imagine, the recovery process can become really complicated. And finally, we have this interesting phenomenon of collective grief. Sometimes when something like a tragedy or a natural disaster happens, you have this sense of loss that affects an entire community or an entire society. Everybody kind of goes through a collective grieving process together. These are different forms of grief, variations on the experience. But what about the aftermath? As you might imagine, there's different trajectories of recovery or non-recovery that people experience during the grieving process. We're going to talk about 5 of them. This is actually the most common trajectory following a loss. It involves very little display of outward distress or emotion. Internally, sometimes there may be some emotion felt, or there may really truly just be a lack of distress. There used to be some negative ideas about this trajectory, that it was maladaptive, that it was just emotional suppression, that it led to worse long-term outcomes because it didn't allow for proper emotional processing. But there's more recent research that has shown that this is actually a trajectory with really positive outcomes, including remembering your loved one more fondly and more positive emotions in general during the grieving process. For the sake of this model, grief is considered chronic if it's continued for a number of years following the loss. It's actually not a very common trajectory, but it tends to be more common if you were highly dependent on the loved one that you lost before the loss. This is one of the most interesting trajectories to me. It's basically the case of someone being depressed before the loss of their loved one and actually improving following the loss. This can happen sometimes if treatment for the dying loved one was very complicated and taxing and now the treatment process is over, or if the relationship was just very difficult and complicated in general. Essentially the opposite of the depressed improved trajectory. This is somebody who was depressed before the loss of a loved one, and the depression either stayed the same or got worse following the loss. In cases like this, the depression can endure for years, and it's not always directly related to the loss. The final trajectory is not a typical one, but it's good to be aware of it because in recent years it's become more popular in this field of research, and it's also potentially one of the most difficult outcomes regarding grief. The DSM-5 has a section in it called Conditions for Further Study. In this section, there's a disorder called Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder, also known as complicated grief. There are several diagnostic criteria. One is that you have to have been experiencing symptoms of grief for at least a year following your loss. The other is that the symptoms are still so significant, they're still experienced so intensely and so frequently that they cause significant impairment in the person's life. So the timeline and severity of symptoms is really what distinguishes complicated grief from what the DSM calls normal grief. It's basically grief that's really intense, lasts for a very long time, and takes a huge toll on your functioning. What really sticks out to me about complicated grief is that it's considered a disorder. It's considered a maladaptive or unhealthy form of grief. So on the one hand, all the reading I've been doing about grief drives home the message that grief is personal and individual and healing happens in your own time. Take as much time as you need. And then on the other hand, a diagnosis like this implicitly sends the message that now your grief is bad, it's taking too long, and you're not getting over it fast enough, and it's affecting you too much. So, what's the truth? What's the right way to grieve? The title of this video is a lie. Nobody can tell you how your grief is supposed to look or how you should grieve. You also can't always control or predict your own grief, as I recently discovered. Obviously, no one wants to experience something like complicated grief, but after the reading I've done, I have my own idea as to why it happens. In my personal opinion, one of the most important turning points in the grieving process is acceptance. Acceptance isn't the point where the pain ends or the grieving ends, but it could be the point where the grief no longer runs your life. I think people suffering from prolonged or complicated grief haven't really accepted their loss yet, and who could blame them? Would you really expect a parent who outlived their young child, or maybe a child who lost their parent, to ever really accept it? Making this video helped me understand my feelings around my recent losses a lot more. And even the feelings and reactions that I still don't quite understand, they don't trouble me as much anymore, because now I know how different grief can look for everyone. And I hope that knowing that is as helpful to somebody else watching as it has been to me.